Hey everybody, this is Dr. Everson giving you a lecture on the Book of Numbers. Don't have a whole lot to say about this today, but hopefully this will be useful to you. I thought it might be good to supply the etymology of the titles that are used for the Book of Numbers. As Christians, we follow the lead of the Septuagint, and we name this book after the Septuagint and the Vulgate that follows it. So arithmoi is the title for this work in the Septuagint. This becomes numeri in the Latin, and from that we get the book, the title Numbers. In Hebrew, it's Vayedaber, which is literally translated, and he said. As we've said before, throughout the Pentateuch, the title given to each of the books in Hebrew is simply taken from the first sentence. It's either the first word or one of the first words that's used in the book. So anyway, that's where the title Numbers comes from. We follow the Septuagint and the Vulgate. The structure for the Book of Numbers, hopefully you got a sense for some of the debate that goes on in academic circles over some of these things. I thought this was your textbook provided a useful overview covering all sorts of different perspectives, and they give you a number of ways you can arrange the contents of the Book of Numbers. Milgram, as you can see on page 96, Milgram arranges it according to chronology. Milgram later analyzes it according to sort of the main phases within it. Budd, the scholar Budd, he arranges it according to topical outline. The simplest and best, I believe, comes from Olson, and that's what the author of your textbook chooses as well. And he simply divides the Book of Numbers into two main sections. The section that's for the generation that will not enter into the promised land, and the section that is for the generation that will enter into the promised land. And so I've renamed those simply Out with the Old, In with the New, not to be unkind to those that didn't enter in, but it's easy to remember this way. And this is a helpful way of dividing up the Book of Numbers because you remember what the main events are within the Book of Numbers. And hopefully, as you're familiar with, having read the Book of Numbers, Joshua and Caleb, among others, go in to spy out the land. And when they come back to give their report to Moses, Joshua and Caleb are confident, despite the odds being against them, or despite the challenge being great, they're confident that they can enter into the land, whereas the other spies lack faith or courage or both. And this is sort of symptomatic of the Israelites in general, who are rebelling and lacking faith before their God. So anyway, Numbers 1 through 25 deal with sort of this negative side of things. And so the first 10 chapters, you have the Israelites in the wilderness of Sinai, and then chapters 11 through 25, you have stories of rebellion and the consequences because of that. In Numbers 26 through 36, we have focus on the preparation and organization of the Israelites before they enter into the Promised Land. So that's a very brief discussion of its structure. How about its genre? Your textbook wonders if there aren't 14 types of genres within the Book of Numbers. On page 95, your textbook mentions narrative or poetry, prophecy, victory song, prayer, blessing, lampoon, diplomatic letter, civil law, cultic law, oracular decision, census list, temple archive, itinerary. Of course, I don't expect you or me to remember that list of 14 for the different types of genre within Numbers. It would be good to remember that Numbers is composed of all sorts of different literary genres. So, between the literary analysis and also the structural analysis of the book, hopefully you get the sense that scholars over the years have had sort of a tough time getting a handle on the book of Numbers, or there's a lack of consensus on exactly what the book of Numbers is, which is great in a way, because it's a book that requires our attention, and it's complex, and there's a lot going on within it. Let me just say a few words on the theology of Numbers. And of course, this gets back to your idea of worldview. As humans, we do two things. I always like to say we think and we act. And there is good and there is bad. We have good thoughts, we have bad thoughts. We have good actions, we have bad actions. And what do you do? What should the consequence be when our thoughts or our actions are bad? When we turn away from God and we turn towards self and we rebel, should God be entirely merciful? Should God be just? Should God be both? And if so, how does that work? These are very large concepts, profound questions to think about. And I have my own answers that I'm comfortable with within my own theology, but these are things I often think about and revisit. And for the Israelites, they're in the situation where they've rebelled against God. They lack faith. They are grumbling. They're sort of unsatisfied or dissatisfied and at odds with God. And what should God do? What should his attitude be? And there we see both mercy and justice within the stories of Numbers. We see justice in the sense that those who have rebelled against God have the consequence of not entering into the promised land. And so that would be a just consequence or a just punishment for their behavior. Now, in today's day and age, there are, somebody who's taught, young people for a number of years. This idea makes some people just uncomfortable, the idea that there should be a consequence for bad behavior. And we don't need to get into all of that other beyond saying that for many folks, the idea of God punishing just immediately makes them uncomfortable, regardless of the person's behavior or the extent of the rebellion. This is sort of an unpopular topic. But I think when we do stop and think about it, justice is something that we want. When we see evil that's done to others, we want justice. So when we're the ones doing the evil, we often don't want justice. So justice, we see justice in the book of Numbers in terms of that consequence, but we also see mercy. God doesn't abandon the people. Their descendants are able to enter into the promised land during during the time of the next generation. And so the promise continues, and God hasn't abandoned his people. He loves them. Though there has been a consequence, there is also the opportunity for redemption in a subsequent generation. And just the fact that we see these two themes, these two phenomena within the book of Numbers, to me is fantastic, because this is one of those threads that we see continuing throughout the Bible, the idea of mercy and justice. And how do you keep mercy and justice held together? And I'm not exactly sure what the perfect formula is in the Old Testament for the balance between mercy and justice. I suppose you do get a numerical balance when you look at the Ten Commandments. It talks about God visiting the sins of the fathers to... Well, let me just read it here. This is in Exodus chapter 20, and I'm reading from verse 5. The text reads, "You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love, chesed, to thousands of those, or to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments." So in the book of Exodus, we do see mercy and justice, and clearly God errs on the side of mercy in the Ten Commandments numerically, right? So you've got 1,000 generations versus 3 or 4. In the New Testament, what's the balance between these things? How does it work? And of course, in the New Testament, the focus is upon the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And in the sacrificial act of Christ on the cross, we see God's mercy and judgment both fulfilled in one single act, right? Our sin is paid for on the cross, and it's in the act of that payment that God shows his mercy to us as well. So in one moment we see God's mercy and justice perfectly fulfilled in the New Testament, which is quite profound. I'll mention also the story of Balaam in the book of Numbers. Yeah, Balaam in Numbers 22, 23, 24 appears as a prophet who is called to speak against the Israelites, but he is unable to do so. He, instead of cursing the Israelites, he blesses the Israelites. And so this would be an example of the providence of God, or God's protection, looking out for the Israelites, even when there are foreign prophets. God works through them in order to bless and watch out for the Israelites. I mentioned Balaam in part because in my studies I did a lot with Aramaic, and Balaam shows up in a non-biblical source. That is to say, one of the oldest pieces of Aramaic that survives. There isn't a whole lot of what they call Old Aramaic out there, but there is some. And one text that survives is called the Deir Allah inscription. And this comes out of Jordan. Deir, I believe, is an Arabic word for monastery, so I think the title comes from the location where it was found, sort of like Allah's monasteries. It's what I've always understood the title to mean. But anyway, it was a location in Jordan where they found an inscription that mentions Balaam, son of Beor. And of course, this is the person who's mentioned in Numbers 22 through 24. And there's a number of things that are interesting in here that find parallel to the biblical text. But Balaam is he's a fascinating character in the Bible, and he shows up outside of the Bible. And within rabbinic literature, I'll add that Balaam is always whenever they refer to the religious opinions of those from the nations, those outside of Israel, those from the Goyim, Balaam is always the one that gets quoted, because Balaam is the opponent who can't help but speak the truth about the Israelites. So anyway, we see mercy and justice going hand in hand in the book of Numbers, which provides a nice basis for the New Testament as well. All right, that's all I have for you on Numbers. I hope you all have a great day.